Just recently, on a humid Saturday night in Phoenix, something shifted on a stage many assumed was already set. Floodlights cut through dust and desert air as thousands of young people, students, service workers, digital creators, first-time volunteers, packed into a rally that analysts once would have dismissed as unlikely territory for Donald Trump. Phones glowed like constellations, chants ricocheted across concrete, and then the crowd didn't look the way political insiders expected it to look. Drone shots lingered over a sea of 18 to 29-year-olds waving homemade signs, filming every moment, and chanting slogans that political scientists are still trying to decode. Campaign strategists whispered backstage. Commentators scrambled on air. By midnight, one phrase dominated the headlines: an unexpected youth surge. In Washington, pollsters recalculated their models. On Wall Street, trading desks quietly gamed out new scenarios. In university dorm rooms, group chats exploded. A bedrock assumption of modern American politics, that younger voters lean overwhelmingly against Trump, suddenly looked less stable. This is not just about one rally, or one crowd, or even one man. It is about a fracture in the 2026 election math that few saw coming. And the question now hanging over American politics is stark. Did we just witness a blip, or the beginning of a realignment? For years, conventional wisdom has been clear. Young voters, especially Gen Z and younger millennials, were supposed to be the most reliably anti-Trump bloc in the electorate. Surveys from Pew Research Center, Circle at Tufts University, and Harvard's Youth Poll consistently showed deep skepticism toward his rhetoric, his policies, and his governing style. Democrats built entire turnout strategies around that assumption. Republicans, meanwhile, focused on older voters, rural communities, and suburban swing blocks, largely writing off youth as hostile terrain. But over the past several months, something quieter and more complicated has been unfolding. Trump's team has been experimenting with new platforms, new messengers, and new themes aimed squarely at younger Americans: economic populism, cultural backlash, anti-establishment framing, and a heavy presence on podcasts, YouTube, and alternative social media ecosystems. Long-form interviews with figures like Joe Rogan, Aiden Ross, and mainstream creators were not accidents. They were strategy. At the same time, frustration with inflation, housing costs, student debt, and perceived political stagnation has been simmering among young voters. Circle researchers warned in recent reports that enthusiasm for traditional democratic institutions was softening, even as distrust of Republican elites remained high. CBS's Margaret Brennan noted on Face the Nation just last week that youth voters are less ideologically predictable than pundits assume. They are issue-driven, volatility-prone, and deeply skeptical of both parties. Political analysts at Brookings, the American Enterprise Institute, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies have been quietly tracking this churn. Their conclusion is not that young voters are suddenly pro-Trump, but that they are more open to disruption than at any point since 2016. So when images from Phoenix began circulating, it wasn't just a rally. It was a stress test of every assumption shaping the 2026 midterms. But to understand why this is so significant, we need to look at what actually happened that night and what it reveals about the political landscape moving forward. The rally began like many others, with security lines snaking for blocks, campaign buses idling, and an air of choreographed spectacle. But the composition of the crowd was immediately striking. Local reporters estimated that nearly half the audience appeared under 30. Drone footage later analyzed by several media outlets showed large clusters of college students, community college groups, and young workers in service uniforms arriving together. The Arizona Republic described it as visibly younger than any recent Trump event in the state. Trump took the stage just after 8:45 p.m. local time. Instead of leading with immigration or culture war themes, he opened with an extended riff on the economy, specifically housing costs, student loans, and what he called the rigged system that crushes young Americans before they even start. He pointed directly at the audience and said, "Your parents were told if you worked hard, you'd be fine. You were told the same lie, and now you're paying for it." The crowd roared. Then came something unprecedented for a Trump rally. A structured segment featuring 3 young speakers, a 22-year-old community college student, a 26-year-old former barista turned small business owner, and a 19-year-old conservative influencer with a massive TikTok following. Each spoke not about social issues, but about rent, wages, and what they described as political betrayal. Cameras lingered on their faces. The audience leaned in. The mood was less confrontational than reflective. According to Reuters, internal campaign staff described the moment as a pivot point in real time. Axios later reported that Republican operatives had been testing youth messaging in swing states for months. But even they were surprised by the reception. By the end of the night, Trump made a statement that sent shockwaves through political circles. They said we couldn't win the youth. They said you'd never show up. Well, look around. And then came the data. Within 48 hours, several pollsters released preliminary tracking suggesting a measurable uptick in youth favorability toward Trump in Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada. Not a majority shift, but a narrowing gap significant enough to rattle strategists. And what happened next reveals something even more critical. The global reaction was swift. In Brussels, EU diplomats privately expressed concern that a younger, more digitally savvy Trump coalition could complicate transatlantic relations. A senior European official told Politico, if Trump broadens his base, the risk to NATO unity increases. In Beijing, state media framed the rally as evidence of American political instability, while analysts speculated about what a youth-friendly Trump might mean for U.S.-China competition. In Washington, reactions were sharper. Democratic leaders moved quickly into damage control. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer warned that Republicans were attempting to rebrand the same agenda in new packaging. Progressive groups like Sunrise Movement and Indivisible argued that young voters were being targeted by economic populism without real policy substance. Republicans, meanwhile, celebrated the moment. Senator J.D. Vance called it a sign that working-class youth are breaking free from elite narratives. House Speaker allies circulated clips from the rally within minutes. Political analysts were divided. Nate Cohn at the New York Times cautioned that one rally does not rewrite the electorate, while CNN's Harry Enton noted that even a modest shift among young voters could swing multiple Senate races in 2026. Social media exploded. On TikTok, clips of Trump speaking about housing went viral, stripped of partisan framing and repackaged as real talk. On X, critics accused the campaign of manipulating optics, while supporters declared a generational realignment. Meanwhile, a Harvard Youth poll rapid survey suggested that while many young attendees still disagreed with Trump on social issues, they resonated with his economic messaging, a contradiction that defies simple partisan labels. But the immediate reactions only scratched the surface. Why does this matter? Because midterm elections are decided not by ideology alone, but by turnout. And young voters are the most volatile turnout group in American politics. Historically, voters under 30 participate at far lower rates than older Americans. But when they do show up, they can dramatically reshape outcomes in swing states. In 2022, for example, Circle estimated that youth turnout helped Democrats outperform expectations in several key races. If even a fraction of that demographic becomes more open to Republican candidates or simply less hostile to Trump, the entire 2026 map shifts. Political analysts point out that Trump's strategy appears to rest on three pillars. First, economic grievance. By focusing on inflation, housing, and student debt, he is speaking to material anxieties that cut across race and ideology. Second, cultural rebellion. Many young voters distrust institutions, universities, media, corporations, and government, and Trump's anti-establishment persona taps into that sentiment. Third, digital insurgency. Unlike traditional campaigns, his team is leaning heavily on influencers, long-form interviews, and meme-driven messaging rather than polished ads. As Margaret Brennan noted, this is less about conversion and more about erosion, chipping away at the Democrats' youth firewall. There are also constitutional and structural implications. If youth support becomes more evenly divided, it could reduce the predictability of future elections, making governing coalitions more fragile and legislative compromise harder. Why does this matter? Because democracy depends not just on who wins, but on whether voters feel represented. And right now, many young Americans feel alienated from both parties. Moments like this are not without precedent. In 1968, Richard Nixon quietly made inroads with younger voters disillusioned by war and social unrest. In 1992, Bill Clinton's youth outreach reshaped the Democratic coalition. In 2008, Barack Obama built an unprecedented digital youth movement that transformed turnout patterns. Trump himself broke political norms in 2016 by attracting working-class voters across age groups who felt ignored by elites. But this moment is different. Unlike past realignments driven by optimism or ideology, this surge appears rooted in frustration, a politics of grievance rather than hope. Over the past decade, housing costs have soared, wages have stagnated for many entry-level workers, and student debt has become a defining feature of young adulthood. Federal Reserve data shows that real wages for many young workers have barely kept pace with inflation. Democrats have made policy moves, from student loan relief attempts to infrastructure investments, but critics argue the benefits feel distant or bureaucratic. Meanwhile, Republicans historically struggled with youth outreach, especially after January 6th, which alienated many young voters. Yet here we are. A pattern is breaking, and history shows us that moments like these rarely unfold as expected. If Trump consolidates even partial youth support, the global implications are profound. Regionally, swing states like Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada, with large, young, and diverse populations, could tilt rightward, reshaping the Senate balance of power in 2026. In terms of international law, a more electorally secure Trump movement might push harder on issues like border enforcement, trade tariffs, and NATO burden sharing, potentially destabilizing existing agreements. Alliances could shift. European partners worry that a strengthened Trump coalition would accelerate U.S. retrenchment from global leadership. Asian allies, particularly Japan and South Korea, are quietly preparing for more transactional diplomacy. Economically, markets reacted nervously to the possibility of renewed tariff policies. The S&P 500 dipped briefly after the rally's footage went viral, while energy stocks saw a modest uptick amid speculation about pro-fossil fuel policies. On security, analysts at CSIS warned that a more populist-driven foreign policy could lead to unpredictable crisis management, especially in Ukraine, the Middle East, and the South China Sea. In short, what looks like a domestic youth rally carries potentially game-changing global consequences. Inside Congress, the reaction has been intense. Democratic committees have already signaled plans for new investigations into campaign influence operations, particularly around social media targeting of young voters. Republicans, emboldened, are preparing legislative packages aimed at lowering housing costs and curbing student debt. Whether genuine policy or political theater remains debated. Party divisions are sharpening. Moderate Democrats fear losing working-class youth, while progressive activists argue the party must double down on social justice issues. On the right, establishment Republicans are uneasy about Trump's populist turn, worried it could alienate corporate donors even as it attracts younger voters. Legal challenges are also brewing. Voting rights groups are monitoring potential changes to ballot access rules in battleground states, wary that turnout dynamics could be manipulated. Public opinion remains fluid. Gallup tracking shows trust in government at historic lows, complicating both parties' messaging. And the domestic ramifications are just beginning to emerge. Wall Street is watching closely. Immediately after the rally, analysts at Goldman Sachs issued a note warning that greater electoral uncertainty in 2026 could increase volatility. Bond markets saw slight fluctuations as traders priced in potential policy shifts. Oil markets edged upward amid speculation that a strengthened Trump bloc might revive aggressive energy production policies. Meanwhile, clean energy stocks dipped slightly. Industries like tech and housing are especially sensitive. Young voters' economic priorities could push both parties toward more aggressive antitrust enforcement or housing reform, policies that would reshape corporate behavior. Several major companies quietly adjusted lobbying strategies, increasing outreach to Republican lawmakers while maintaining ties with Democrats. Long-term projections from the Congressional Budget Office suggest that whichever party captures momentum in 2026 will shape fiscal policy for years, affecting everything from student loans to defense spending. The economy, in other words, is now part of this political drama. The battle over interpretation has begun. Conservative outlets framed the rally as proof of a silent youth majority. Progressive media dismissed it as a staged event with hand-picked speakers. Mainstream outlets like the New York Times and Reuters struck a more cautious tone, emphasizing uncertainty and mixed data. Meanwhile, misinformation spread rapidly. Viral clips were edited to exaggerate crowd size. Fake polls circulated on TikTok. Foreign actors were suspected, though not confirmed, of amplifying divisive content. International media offered starkly different perspectives. The BBC treated the surge as a warning sign for democratic stability, while state-run outlets in Russia and China portrayed it as evidence of American decline. Social media algorithms, driven by engagement rather than accuracy, accelerated polarization. This is not just politics, it is information warfare. 3 paths now lie ahead. Best case scenario: both parties respond constructively. Democrats recalibrate toward economic populism. Republicans moderate on social issues, and youth engagement rises across the board, strengthening democratic participation rather than deepening division. Worst case scenario: the rally becomes a flashpoint for deeper polarization. Disinformation intensifies, voter suppression battles escalate, and 2026 becomes a chaotic legitimacy crisis election with lasting damage to public trust. Most likely scenario: a mixed outcome. Some young voters shift right, others double down left, and turnout becomes unpredictable, producing razor-thin races in multiple states. Key variables include inflation, housing policy, international crises, and how campaigns handle social media. But perhaps the most critical question is whether this surge represents persuasion or protest. Zoom out, and this moment fits into a larger global story. Across democracies, from Brazil to France to India, young voters are restless, skeptical, and searching for alternatives outside traditional party structures. Economic insecurity, digital media, and cultural polarization are reshaping politics worldwide. The Phoenix Rally is not an anomaly. It is part of a broader realignment in how power, information, and identity interact in the 21st century. Americans are not just choosing candidates, they are renegotiating what representation means. And this story is still unfolding. What does this all mean? First, for American foreign policy, a more electorally secure Trump movement could lead to sharper shifts in alliances, trade, and military commitments. Second, for global power dynamics, unpredictability in U.S. politics reverberates worldwide, affecting everything from climate negotiations to conflict zones. Third, for regional stability, battleground states will become even more contested, heightening political tension at home. Fourth, for democratic norms, trust in institutions remains fragile, and how parties respond to youth frustration will shape legitimacy. Fifth, for international law, trade rules, sanctions, and treaties could face renewed pressure. Sixth, for economic interconnectedness, markets will remain volatile as political outcomes grow harder to predict. Seventh, for future presidential decision-making, candidates in both parties will recalibrate strategies toward younger voters. And finally, as Margaret Brennan cautioned, this is not a final verdict. It is a signal of dissatisfaction, uncertainty, and potential change. We must be careful not to overstate what we saw in Phoenix. It is real, but it is not definitive. Still, the rally exposed a crack in assumptions that shaped politics for nearly a decade. Just as the night began with dust, lights, and chance, it ends with a question that lingers over 2026 and beyond. Who truly speaks for America's next generation? And this is far from over. If you're following this story and want clear, fact-driven analysis without hype, stay engaged with the evidence as it continues to emerge. This is a developing situation, and we will continue to provide in-depth coverage as new data, reporting, and reactions come in. Share your thoughts in the comments, especially on whether you think economic issues or cultural issues will matter more to young voters in 2026. What do you think the long-term consequences will be for American democracy? Subscribe for continued coverage and expert analysis as this story evolves. Turn on notifications so you don't miss future updates, because the next turning point may come sooner than anyone expects. In our next video, we'll examine how youth turnout strategies are being rebuilt across both parties, and what that means for the future of elections in America.